I have a ton of experience. As the chart says, my name is Eric Hards. I work for Lockheed Martin. I've been doing live webcast production in various different forms for the last 7 years. My first live webcast was, let's plug a server in under my desk and hook up a camera and see if the CIO wants to talk to somebody. And it worked. So after that, we just figured out better and faster and more interesting ways to support live events. The majority of them, as some of you are probably doing now, are mostly executive-based events. The CIOs, the VPs, the director levels, primarily because they have a lot of people they want to talk to, and they can't travel to all of our locations. We have 140,000 people all over the globe. We currently don't have an infrastructure yet that allows, say, our president to talk to all 140,000 people. But if you attended any of my other presentations, you know we kind of built this from the ground up. But what I'm going to focus more in this presentation are the many things that I've learned over my live production and how to kind of make sure that you're successful in those. It's kind of a little different take than some of the presentations we've been hearing earlier today. And this is just a little background to let you know kind of what, how we do our live stuff and how many we do a year, just to give you a good feel as to where my background comes from. Essentially we're an internal group, and we're a little fragmented. So we have these internal groups in different parts of Lockheed Martin that also do additional webcasting work. So in general, we have about 40 to 60 of these live events that are executive-based a year. And those audiences range in size from 20 people to 1,800 people to, we do some larger events now into the 4,000 range. Interestingly enough, even though we have 140,000 people, we don't really get numbers more than about 4,000 watching any given event. And that's primarily because the audience is fragmented. So a vice president of a particular division will be talking to his particular employees. We've had some discussions about doing a Lockheed Martin presidential all-employee webcast, but our infrastructure is not built for it yet. So we haven't quite got there. I'll skip over this slide real quick. I think most of you already know that why are we suddenly here having an enterprise division of Streaming Media West? Well, because these things are converging. We've got computers on desktops that can handle the power of streaming video. We have networks that are finally robust enough to deal with the streaming video. And we have enough interest from our employees and our executives to say we really need streaming video. So I think being here, you already know all that. I wanted to give you an idea of what our current growth and what our projected growth is for our streaming environment. So as you can see, it's pretty much a logarithmic curve. And this is based on real numbers up through 2012. So the numbers that you see in 2009, 2010, 2011, these are enterprise numbers, so I kind of gather them throughout the enterprise. And we do start to see a little bit of a fall off at the curve on the number of live events, but you'll notice that the viewership continues to go up. So that curve is based a little bit on Gartner's prediction that you can only produce so many live events within a company. At some point, you're going to have a trail off because you can't do them every day, 24 hours a day. But your viewerships can continue to go up as you add more content for folks to be looking at. So more than likely, if you were to go past 2014, you'd see a crossing of those lines. Viewership would still continue to go up and eventually fall off based on your number of employees in the company itself. So these are my top 10 lists of what I'm going to go through today. These are the things that I have found when I look back in hindsight. Obviously, a lot of this came from School of Hard Knocks, but going back and looking at it as to what was successful, what worked, and what didn't work, and hopefully it'll help you guys as well. The number one thing I can tell you is setting these expectations with your customers. Or the people that you're doing the live events for, even the on-demand video for, because they're coming in with these expectations of YouTube video, of HD quality, of the thousands, tens of thousands, millions of viewers that you hear about, for things like rock concerts or Victoria's Secret rollouts or things like that. So that's their thought process when they come and say, I want to do a webcast for my organization. So you have to kind of set their expectations to say, well, we're going to have one camera, and it's going to be in a conference room, and it's going to be you talking. It's not going to be a lavish production, or it could be a lavish production if they want to bring the funds that go along with that. At least in our case, it's not an overhead budget where I can do a Spielberg production for my executives, unfortunately. So helping to set that expectation has helped tremendously, where I definitely have some of those conversations are difficult because they'll be, well, what do you mean it's not going to have this, or it's not going to be this, or we're not going to be able to talk to every employee. Something as simple as setting an expectation of a good event is a 20% audience participation. That's a good event. 10% is actually decent. So if they're going to invite 4,000 people and they get 400, they feel like, oh, we only got 400. Oh, that's a good number. So setting that expectation up front helps that when, at the end, if they got 500, then they feel like, wow, that was really successful, because you said I'd only get 400 if it was good. So again, helping to set that expectation. I gave this example of flying an airplane for live events. If you think about flying an airplane, there's this relatively stressful period that happens at the beginning when you're taking off. And then there's this period while you're in the air, which is relatively uneventful. And then there's this horrible, stressful thing that happens at the end when you land. And in my opinion, that's kind of work. There's a lot of work that goes into making sure that the plane takes off appropriately. While the event is happening, you're not doing much except looking at a screen, maybe some production work. And at the very end, you're hoping that when you turn everything off, you don't get suddenly a whole bunch of emails that said, oh, it was choppy and I couldn't see it and it wasn't working appropriately. So I give that example of kind of flying an airplane. And how can I get around those things? What are the things that can lower my stress level on takeoff and make sure that I don't have that horrible event at the end when I have landing? And then finally, having your customers set their audience expectations, because sometimes you don't have insight into the communications that's happening between your customer and their audience. Letting them know what they're going to be seeing, giving them the ability to test to make sure that their computer works, helping them understand that, it's not going to be HD quality full screen. It's going to be this tiny window with audio, which sounds like it's coming out of a radio, depending on your bandwidth. So that can also help in toning down that landing opportunity when you suddenly get all those emails like, well, it wasn't full screen and it wasn't HD. My number 2 is the network, and I've always referred to this network as this gigantic, unruly monster that I have no control over, that changes daily. And that's unfortunate when you're trying to deliver a live webcast, because it may or may not work today or tomorrow or the next day. So in order to circumvent some of that and to mitigate my risks, I try and continue to maintain connections with my network folks as much as possible. And that means things like we do ORRs, or simple telephone calls that says, hey, does anyone see any reason why we might have a problem with this webcast next week? And in most cases, you can't foretell the future, so they're like, nope, we don't see any problems. But every once in a while, there'll be someone on the phone that says, hey, aren't we doing a big network push for a Windows update on that day? And we go, yeah, that could become a problem. And you have that discussion, and that gets solved as opposed to becoming a problem during that landing portion of your webcast. One of the other things I try and do, and if any of you are network folks, you'll know that very rarely do you get the calls of, thanks, you're doing such a great job with the network. It's usually, it's broken again, why don't you fix it? So I try and be overly nice to my network people, thank them for what they're doing, because in a lot of cases it pays off when I'm having difficulties and they work really hard to fix my problems. So if you can, get really close to your network folks, get cell numbers, their home numbers, their wife's home numbers, anything that can allow you to have that extra help when you need it, or even when you're doing your planning. We're looking at expanding a webcast to multiple connections. We're looking at going on VPN. We're looking to go across our international firewall. All of those are great questions to throw at these people that know you, so that they instead of getting bothered with all the other things they're doing, they say, oh, that's Eric. I better get back to him because I know he's planning this event for some executive. It also helps with gathering the metrics, so again, I don't have a lot of insight into our actual network. I can tell you how many people watch and those kinds of things, but I can't come back and say, well, how many packets were lost between our WAN and our LAN connections in such and such location. So I can go and hit them up and say, we had a problem in, say, Valley Forge. So can you tell me what was going on in the network at that time? And get some feedback from that. Was it me? Was it the encoder? Was it the particular viewer? Was it the router? And it'll help me solve those problems easier when I'm trying to get that feedback. So like I said, early communications with your network team, keep them notified up front. I was just in the panel before this, and the number one lessons learned I told the group is plan with your network team. We had a 7-year growth of let's see if we can do it, which worked really well as far as getting buy-in and getting people to use it. But now that we're rolling out an enterprise initiative, our network team are coming back and saying, we're not ready for this. We're not ready to go 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 connections. So again, get in early with your network folks. Obviously planning, most of our events, I try when I'm setting that customer expectation, I let them know that we are planning a live television show. They don't think of it that way. They think, it's a webcast. No, it's a live television show because things have to start on time, they have to end on time. You have to be ready, all the microphones have to be ready, all of your speakers have to be ready, slides, cameras, lights, you name it. So we start these planning sessions ahead of time, and I'll show you to do something. The checklist has these simple items, things like who's doing stage decoration? And that might be there is no stage decoration. Fine, we'll just cross that one off. But if there is, who's going to be planning that? Who's going to be doing that? So that there are plants on stage, there's a bottle of water, there's chairs, there's tables, and so on. So, and that's, again, at the executive level. It's not talking at your desk. But we do start these 3 to 4 weeks ahead of time. We track all the items and who's responsible for them. We have roughly 26 currently items on our checklist that ballooned at one point into 50, and then we scaled it back a little bit. Combined a few. And then we also use that same checklist when we go through our lessons learned, and we do a lessons learned after the majority of our events. And that's how we add to or subtract from that checklist. If we find something that we didn't track well or should be tracked, we'll add that to the checklist. So the checklist that I'll give you an example of here will give you an idea of how that grew over a 5-year period of time. Starting out with, is the camera and the microphone ready to, like I said, stage decoration and runner mics and a few other things that we've added to the checklist. So this is the very fancy Excel spreadsheet that we finally got to. We started out with essentially a list in a Word file. But this allows us to choose who's covering what, and it breaks it down, as you can see, by there's the webcast details, the customer's details. So this is all the information we track for the actual event. And then there's a set of items that we're responsible for as a team that we also track. So this is relatively easy to develop in an Excel environment or even a Word environment where you just write down very simple things that you'd want to look at from your perspective and who you would assign them to, because you're probably doing it right now. You're already saying, like, hey, has anyone checked the microphones, make sure they're working? That's something that could easily be on this list, and it's assigned to someone. And not only do they know it's their responsibility, but now it's off your plate as the producer to say, okay, someone's handling that particular event. So I think it helps tremendously to have this. And with some of our customers, it's a very quick 15-minute phone call because they've done enough of these that we can say, is that still going to be John? Yeah, okay, we'll put John down. Is Mary going to handle that? Yeah, okay, we'll put her down. So it's real fast, it's quick. But with our newer customers, this also helps us set expectations. Because one of the questions, for instance, is, how many speakers are you going to have? And he said, well, we're going to have 5 speakers. Okay, then we need 5 mics and 2 cameras. Well, why do you need 2 cameras? Well, we can't go bouncing back and forth between each of your panel members. We have to have a wide shot and a close-up shot. So, I didn't think about that. And that also means I need to have somebody who's going to be handling switching between those 2 cameras. So those kinds of questions come up and allows us to set these expectations while we're doing this checklist. They get to see the checklist, and therefore they start to understand a little bit more about this isn't just a webcast, it's a live television production. So a little bit about equipment. One of the things that, as we see here, and I'm never on this side of the camera, so I hate looking at lights. I always tell my customers we need the lights so that you can look good. And one of the things I do a lot with my folks, and some of you may have had this problem too, where you need that person to stand right here because that's where the lighting is best. But they have a tendency to do this, right? They're walking around, that kind of thing, right? Right, exactly. I want to get out of the way of the lights. So one of the things I'll do is, again, setting expectations with the presenter, is I'll sit there and go, if you stay here, you're going to look your best on camera. You can go anywhere you want. We'll follow you. But you're going to look your absolute best right here. It works a lot better with women than it does with men, but it does work. And it gets them to kind of say, oh, I want to look my best. So I'm going to stay right here and make sure that that happens. So that does help when I'm trying to get them to sit there. So lighting, good lighting has been nothing but great dividends. I can get a lighting set for most conference rooms for $1,500, and it will make dramatic differences in the quality of your video. Just most of the encoders out there today just need a good quality video signal to get something that's going to look good on the other end. Obviously, the video signal, how you're getting that signal. If you can start with HD signal, even if you're only shipping out a 400 by 200 widescreen, it's still going to look better if you're shipping that encoder in HD signal than if you're giving it a composite. So getting to that as well. One of the other things that we'll do sometimes, we have a lot of travel events. So wherever the executive is where we go. It's very difficult to usually get them to come to us. So in order to keep costs down, we try and bring in either local teams or vendors. And it's interesting when you start looking at the numbers for that. You can usually get a camera operator for anywhere between $1,100 and $1,600 for the day. If I put somebody on a plane and he's a Lockheed Martin employee and I got to pay him his hourly wage and I got to pay his meals and his travel, it's usually about the same. But where I usually find the difference is if I have good vendors. That vendor is somebody who's a camera operator who does it 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day. I don't run a camera that way. I run a camera whenever they need me to run a camera. So usually I get same price, much better quality, sometimes better equipment because a lot of these folks come with their own cameras. So just something to consider when you're looking at when you're looking at cost. In some cases, it can be less expensive with better quality by using external folks as opposed to your own internal. We actually got to the point where we had to create portable units of all of our equipment because we did move around. And this could be a problem even in a single facility where you're using conference rooms for your webcasts or offices for your webcasts. Let me get to that. I'll come back to this slide so I have a couple examples of kind of the idea of this portable equipment. This is just a wiring diagram. We always use 2 encoders for our executive events. So if we have one for failover. And we record to tape, so if everything dies, we still can go back to tape and ultimately end up with a VOD. But everything is quite small. We've got small AV switches, small audio mixers, and then we also have a portable unit that's got everything in it. So this is a dual monitor, DVD, compressor, mixer, 2 dual wireless microphones, a video switcher, and a digital video recorder, all in a unit that's roughly 2 by 3. On wheels, and we can pretty much move that in and out around the facility wherever we need it. And it makes it very simple because we've got that and we've got some cameras and encoders. So it makes it relatively easy. It's all pre-wired. You plug things in, you're good to go. So let me back up real quick here. So like I said, multiple recorders for redundancy. We have failover encoders and failover servers for most of these events. It does create internally some distribution issues, right? You got to get video signals, slide signals, and audio signals to 2 boxes. So you still need distribution abilities. That box that I showed you had an internal DA so that I can break out VGA signals for slides and video for the individual encoders. And then the other problem we run into a lot is we don't know where the location is and what we're going to have in the room. Sometimes there'll be a projector that has a VGA or a DVI out, and sometimes there won't be, so we have to break it out. And that's just our environment. We don't have a studio, for instance. We have to go to conference rooms, and those change from room to room or even from site to site based on where we are. So we try and bring with us the equipment that could help us in, how could we break out that VGA signal? How can we get the audio out of that computer that's in the podium because you want to play a video? So asking those questions up front and having those devices, and these are all tiny devices, usually less than $300, but it's there in my kit, and I can get that quickly and get that broken out. House audio is always fun. If you're working anywhere that has a conference center or even an executive conference room that has built-in microphones for the VTC, usually that's what we run into is there's a VTC system. It's got microphones. They're used to those microphones, and somehow we have to get that and webcast it. That's always a problem, trying to get that audio out. It's amazing to me the number of systems I've run across that have no ability whatsoever to get audio out of them. They just didn't think that that would ever be a selection. Same thing I said there, you may need to be able to have to take the audio from the computer because they've come in and go, oh yeah, I got 10 videos I want to show on my computer. Well, how am I going to get the audio out? How am I going to get that video signal out of the computer into my video signal on my webcast? You might need something like a VGA to composite or component converter so that you get that video into a switcher and then allow it to come across to you as a webcast. We do use iPods for our video sources. We use them for test signals, and we use them for testing our webcasts. Usually we have a really great movie or something on there that people are actually going to want to watch so that we can do testing. I'm not sure that's completely legal, but it does bring testers in, which is always good. But like I said, we have test tones, test generators, our countdown timer. We always run a 30-minute countdown. That allows us to make sure everything's functional before we've gone live. It allows us to get some folks online in different locations for viewing to verify you can see the video, you can see the slides, you can hear the audio. I can't tell you that it's not a huge number, but the number of times I've been saved by that countdown. Simple things like, okay, it's running, no one's seeing it, what's wrong? Oh, the streaming server needs to be rebooted, it got a patch last night. I reboot the server, everything's functional, nobody knows that there was a problem other than me. And that's fine, because I don't want anyone else to know that there was a problem. But that's because I had the 30-minute countdown that let me test everything 30 minutes before. There's a lot of things you can fix 30 minutes before that webcast starts. Some things you can't, but it definitely helps. And then at a lot of our stuff, we do this cheap equipment. Stuff we know is going to break, but we do it because we can get it. So I can run down to Radio Shack and I can get an AV switch. I can get composite stuff. I can't normally get component stuff. I can get simple audio connections. So in some cases, if I'm going to a facility that I don't know, I may actually be using inexpensive equipment for just that reason because I can back myself up with it. And I showed you these already. So understanding who's involved is also something that has helped know, who's the decision maker? Is it the person that's going through that checklist with you, the one who's really making the decisions, or are they there representing someone else so that you're going to have to go through the checklist again once they're available? Those are things that can help you up front, by asking that question. So, are you the one presenting? Simple question. It turns out they're not. Then it can be, well, are you able to make decisions for that person? Or do we need to have that person online and talk to them? A lot of cases you're not going to be able to talk to, say, the executive presenter. So knowing who they are, and then getting their contact information, names, emails, phone numbers, cell phones, because inevitably things change, as we all know, and we need decisions on how we're going to deal with those changes. It could be something as simple as, the room that you reserved that you said was going to have network connection doesn't have network connection. So who do we call? Who is the person we got to call to make sure that we get network in that room? It is always, I prefer to talk to the presenter myself. What I usually will do is, if it's an executive and I know I'm not going to be able to talk to them before the event, is I'll tell whoever their handler is, I need them there 30 minutes before the start of the event so that we can do things like get them on microphone, show them where to stand. And usually I can do those things in about 10 minutes. So that gives me 20 minutes to talk to them about, if you stand here, you're going to look your best. If you look over here all the time at the slides, you're not going to be engaging the webcast audience, who's that camera in the back of the room. And these things really help, even if they're 20 minutes before the event, have that presenter come across much better for the actual webcast itself. So I always try and tell them to come in, a good 30 minutes before. So I've got my timer running, everything's working, that's counting down. Now I can go over and talk to the presenter and tell them about where they should be standing and how the camera should be, and even things like starting signals. We do something very simple where we'll just say, I'm going to count down from 10. At 5, I'm going to show you 5 fingers, and they're going to go away, and when I point at you, you're live. They understand that. They're good to go, as opposed to, is it on? Are we ready? Are we going now? Because that just, you take your president of your webcast, and they just don't look good anymore when they do that kind of thing. I have on here who will be providing the financing, because we're a direct organization, which I highly recommend if you're trying to figure out how you're going to fund this, as opposed to being overhead. Overhead is nice because you never have to worry about your money until you have to worry about your money, which is when they say, we can't afford you anymore, thanks for coming. And I've been through several of those, and inevitably what happens is I say, well, yeah, here's where I get all my money. It's not from your overhead. I get it from their overhead. And they go, okay, that's fine. Keep doing what you're doing. But then I need to know how I'm getting paid. So that is part of that setting expectation. I have to say, by the way, we're not free. This comes out of your budget. We use charge numbers. So I need a charge number in order to get that paid. And then finally, who's these roles and responsibilities, which usually falls out of that checklist that I gave you. Who the presenters are, who are going to be mic runners, who is responsible for the room, and so on. Understanding who this video is going to. What kind of equipment do they have? How are they going to be connected? These seem like sometimes things you may not have any control over. If it's internal, you're dealing with the internal network, with whatever the company-provided computer is, with the company-provided browser. But sometimes you'll have these discussions up front, and suddenly it'll be, well, this is all going international. In our environment, we have an international firewall between us and our normal network. And that firewall doesn't deal well with certain kinds of videos. So it does help to know that up front so that we can say, hey, the majority of your audience is going to have some issues if we normally do a webcast, so instead we're going to do this other approach. Maybe it's a VOD for them as opposed to doing live. So asking those questions up front, understanding, where are they watching? We're sending this video out to all of our work-at-home folks. Well, that means they're probably going to be on cable modems doing VPN, and that could affect whether or not I deliver a higher quality stream or even deliver slides along with the actual video itself. Time zones. We're a multinational company, so if we're doing a webcast at 8 in the morning Pacific time, does that work well for our East Coast folks or even our UK folks or our Middle East folks? How is it going to be viewed? Is everyone going to be watching on desktops, or are they going to be in conference rooms? If they're in conference rooms, how are they going to deal with things like Q&A? Because we have a Q&A system that is entered via keyboard. So if there are 10 people in a room, how is each one of those going to answer a question? So again, it just helps to ask those questions up front, understand who that audience is going to be and how they're going to interact with the actual presentation itself. And you may find through that discussion that there won't be any issues, but inevitably something will come up that'll say, well, let's talk about that. Again, setting my expectations with the customer, saying your audience is going to have some difficulties watching what you would like to do. So let's talk about the best way to deliver that. I once told somebody, they asked me, well, what do you do at Lockheed Martin? I said, I'm a risk mitigator. Because that's pretty much all I ever did. I was trying to figure out all the things that could possibly go wrong on a webcast and what things I can put in place to mitigate those risks. And inevitably, I would get bitten by something, something I had no concept of. I'm trying to think of the last one we had was, riverbed appliances. If you have caching devices in your network, if those aren't set up appropriately to allow the pass-through for multicast traffic, then they don't like it. So somebody changed riverbed appliances on me, and now the riverbed admin is part of my ORR. And I get to say, are they set up? And they say yes, and I check that box. But I had a webcast that failed because of that, because I didn't know. But that becomes part of my risk mitigation, is asking that question. Everything okay? Are the rules set up on the riverbed appliances? And when they say yes, I've mitigated my risk. And if it comes back during the webcast and it turns out that the riverbed appliances were a problem, well, I mitigated my risk. Let's go talk to the guy who said it was done and see what he has to say. I do a lot of what-if scenarios, like, well, what if the riverbeds don't work? Then what am I going to do? How am I going to deliver this? Or what if my encoders died? That's how we got the tape decks, by the way, and the digital recorders, because I had a coder die on me, and we couldn't recover the on-demand video because it wasn't recorded on the drive. So instead, I had this tape backup at the time. Now we use digital recorders to record the event. And I don't hardly ever go back to them, but there's that one time, right, that you need that video because the encoder died. And then I use that planning checklist that I already showed you. It helps tremendously in setting expectations and helping to mitigate those risks. Network testing and server testing. We actually do a load test on our servers before every certain level of executive event. So it does a couple of things for us. One is we say that we have tested the servers specifically for the presidential's webcast, and everyone likes that. but it also allows me to say that, hey, everyone after that test is good to go as well. So I get to sign them up by saying, hey, we tested the servers, we're good to go. I didn't do it just for you, but I had to do it for this webcast. So we usually do those quarterly, sometimes more frequently depending on how many events we actually have. But we do load tests on the servers. And the load tests on the servers have also been invaluable because it helps to show us where we have some deficiencies. We had one where we had significant problems with the load test, and it turned out to be the database needed to be defragmented. It was, again, something I didn't know, but now that's on my checklist. Things like lost shipments, because we do ship a lot of equipment. What's your mitigation for that? Is it going to Radio Shack and buying the stuff that you need? Is it that in our case, we usually ship a couple days before overnight, so it does sit there for a day, but at least that gives me a day to recover. I have driven to a FedEx office at 10 o'clock at night because the device was there and I needed it, but it was there the day before, so I was still able to set up for the event. What happens when you go over capacity? Are you limiting it on the server? Are you limiting it through a registration process? What is your risk mitigation if you go over capacity and the network becomes a problem, or you affect business critical functions on the network? What's your mitigation for that? We use registration systems. Sometimes we'll use server limits. We'll limit the number of connections through that process. It depends kind of on whether it's a live event or a VOD. On the audience side, how do we mitigate the fact that they just got a brand new Windows 7 laptop and they have no concept if they're going to be able to see the video? In a lot of cases, we actually send an email out that's pre-canned, and the email describes, thank you very much, you've registered for the webcast, here's the link, and oh, by the way, you should test your connection beforehand, here's the test link, verify you can see and hear everything, and by the way, if you can't, here's the 800 number to call if you have any problems. So I've mitigated my risk. It doesn't mean they did it, but when a director somewhere says, I clicked on that webcast and I couldn't see it, and it turns out it's because their laptop didn't have Windows Media, I can say, were you able to test? And they said, well, I didn't click on the test link. Okay, well, we'll get you Windows Media, but that's the reason why we do the test. So I've mitigated my risk. You didn't test, so I can't fix that problem, but that's why we have it out there. It's not always going to make people happy, but it does take that pressure off of you as saying, well, why didn't you think of that? Video production failure. So are you looking at an extra camera? Are you looking at an extra mic? Are you looking at an extra mixer? Or do you have the ability to get a hold of those items quickly, either through your vendors or through your production staff? These kind of things you never think about until they happen. When you lose a microphone in the middle of a webcast, has anyone ever had to replace a microphone on an executive in the middle of their webcast? It's not a fun thing, but I guarantee you're better off to get the bad look from him halfway through the webcast than hearing about it that no one can hear it at the end of the webcast. So if you even question whether or not you should walk up there and change his mic, go up and change his mic. But you need a mic to change, right? So that goes back to this equipment just from that perspective. It could be something as simple as a battery, but you don't want to be changing the battery. You want to be giving him a new mic and letting him go on and then worry about changing the battery, which you should have checked and done before you started, but we won't go there. I talked about the webcast start failure. You start everything up and it's still not broadcasting. Well, that's why we have a countdown. It gives us the opportunity to check to make sure everything's functional, that the cameras are functional, that the microphones are working correctly, the lighting looks good. I can look at it on a computer because, as we all know, what I see on that really beautiful $2,000 reference monitor in the back is not how it looks on the computer. And sometimes I need to tweak color and brightness and those types of things so it looks decent on the computer. And I can do all of that by using that 30-minute countdown timer, which, by the way, does have audio and has animation, and actually halfway through has somebody come on and talk about webcasting and how to ask a question. It'll say, if you want to ask a question, click on the question button and type in your question. So all those things actually, it turns out to be an educational piece for your viewers, so that they start to learn a little about the system, and it also gives them the ability to get on early and make sure that their stuff is set up appropriately as well. A couple other things on that webcast failure that I brought up here was, real-time admin support. having someone that can go in and do that reboot of a server. We don't always have somebody online, but on high-level events we will, so that we can, essentially it comes down to sending an IM. I can do an IM to the admin. They're online. I can say, look, the server needs to be rebooted, and they'll reboot the server right then. So again, I've mitigated that risk within that 30-minute time frame by having that person online and available for me. We also now, we just recently started this about a year and a half ago, where we bring on the technical team. So we have a network guy, a server guy, a riverbed guy, a VPN guy, all on one IM. So while we're doing the event, if somebody has something critical, they can blast that out to the group, and we immediately get responses. So if somebody says, look, we're seeing packet failure in Valley Forge, we instantly hear responses from the VPN team saying, yeah, it's a VPN issue, we know it's a problem, or the LAN team if it's a LAN issue. So that having that little communication is kind of nice, and it's instantaneous, and everyone knows they need to be there during that particular event. Encoder server failure, obviously, like I said, we will always run 2 encoders on events that just cannot fail, quote unquote. We've literally got it down to our only single point of failure is the network. And again, that goes back to that big ugly beast that I can't control. So if the network goes down, and again, it's out of my hands because I don't control the network, then I can say I had everything else prepared. I could not control the network, and it went down. I've only had a network failure once, fortunately. Over on the right-hand side, I just wanted to say that some of these things, it's very easy to say there's costs associated with that, like the fact we only own 1 encoder, so now I got to buy 2 to be redundant. So in a lot of cases, I let my customer decide how much risk that they're willing to take on. So if I have 2 encoders and I need, say, 2 cameras, and I have to buy another camera in order for that redundancy, I make sure the customer understands that there's a cost associated for that. If you're willing to accept the risk, we won't buy the camera. But if you're not willing to accept the risk, then we'll buy the camera and we'll charge you for that, or bring in that extra person to be online to be able to watch the server. So when you look at some of these things, you can easily start adding the stuff in your head saying, this is just going to add cost. Well, that cost is associated to risk, and as long as you're not taking on the risk, you let your customer take on that risk. Let them decide if it's worth the cost. Even though you and I might say, I really want that other encoder there because if it crashes, it's going to be my fault. Yes and no, because at the end of the day, I said, there's a cost associated with this. If you're okay with the risk, we won't have the second encoder. They signed off on it. Well, then you've got yourself covered. Again, I've mitigated my risk of ultimately being the problem. Yes, a real dry run with speakers and all equipment in place. This is actually hard with our executive levels, and so sometimes we'll have stand-ins. But here's how I sell it. In a lot of cases, I'll tell the handlers that we really want to do a dry run with the executive, and it's for us, but we also will let them review that dry run so that they can kibitz and take a look at things that they want to change, and it actually is a practice for them. So I try and sell that as more of a practice idea, but it allows me in a lot of cases to see what is that individual's mannerisms. Are they going to be running back and forth on the stage? Are they very quiet? Do they say things that are going to cause my mic to pop? So these things can really help in the production having that dry run. Plus, if I've got cameras and lights in place, I can see how it's going to look. I'll bring up the servers. I'll broadcast it. I'll have folks look at it elsewhere, give me their comments on what's working. Is it too bright? Are the colors off? So anytime you can get the speaker there to do the dry run, it's hugely beneficial. If you can't, still do the dry run. You can have somebody else stand up there and at least check the lighting, check the audio, make sure that everything is functioning appropriately. Yeah?
Run into issues with them being concerned about what they're going to be saying already being out there? I mean, if you're putting it out and you're testing it on your actual live system, can't people tune in?
Oh, I see. Right. No, it's all locked down via password. So if for our on-demand, not on-demand, our dry runs, it's only a handful of people that can actually see the dry run. And then we remove them for the servers and delete them afterwards, unless they want to keep them. We've had some situations where we've had folks do a complete presentation dry run, and then we've given them the link so that they can review it that night. and then come back in the morning and benefit from that. But they are password protected, so yeah, you're right, not everybody can go see them. Like I said, it makes everyone obviously feel more comfortable, gives them the chance to practice. Allows us to test the system, make sure everything's in place. And it also gives the customer the opportunity to take a look at how things are set up, the lighting, that, oh yeah, it's going to be bright, but I'll have to get used to it. Where their audience is going to be, how they're going to look. All those things are really helpful from the presenter's perspective, not only as yours as the producers. And we also get a lot of questions during this process. Someone will say, well, how am I going to handle questions? Because no one's to the presenter yet. Well, that's a great question. Let's tell you how questions are going to get handled. And now they feel more comfortable over that question as opposed to standing there during the webcast with 1,000 people watching going, how are we doing questions? So again, dry run is very helpful for that. And the final bullet I think is kind of important. I have been a huge proponent of not changing anything at the dry run, unless there's not enough light or the volume needs to be turned up. Because when I start making changes, then that gives me more risk, right? If I start, let's bring in another camera, or let's add more presenters, or let's bring in another set of charts, those kinds of things add risk from my perspective. So it's really not a time to be making dramatic changes, even though it happens. But that's, again, helps setting those expectations up front. That's not where we're going to be making changes. We just want to make sure everything's functioning appropriately. Test. Test the equipment before it leaves. Test the equipment when it gets there. Test the connections to the network with your laptop before you even have everything set up. Do you have the connection? Test all the equipment once it's set up. Test the power when you're there. And I can just go on and on and on, because you're not going to have that time to do it the day of. In most cases, we set up for these events the day before. Sometimes we'll set them up in the morning of if it's a location we've used before and a speaker we've done before and it's using the same equipment. Those kinds of things we will do. But in general, we try and set up the day before. And so testing all of that ahead of time. Like I said, we test the servers way before the event. We bring people together on our ORR to verify that everything is going to be ready. So again, this is another one of my big risk mitigations. Now, in addition to all that, I can't tell you the number of events that I've seen fail, or not fail, but not have good production because someone wasn't wearing headphones. They just looked at the meters, right? Well, those meters that are jumping up and down is distortion. It's not someone talking. Something as simple as testing the audio ahead of time to verify that the mics are set appropriately. That you have line level inputs versus mic level inputs or vice versa. Those kinds of things seem relatively simple, but I have many, many times found that, oh, look, somebody turned the line level switch on instead of the mic level, and if we had gone live with that, all we would have is distortion instead of a talking human. So the more that you can test, and if you have a checklist for this, extremely helpful. So you can just sit there and go, did anyone check the audio on the mics? Yes. Okay, are we good with the mixer? Yes. The switcher good? Yeah. And, did we see video signal? Yes. Did we hear audio? Yes. Sometimes you're going to probably think that myself or the people who do this are a little anal retentive, and that's probably true. But like I said, I'm a risk mitigator. If I can go down that checklist, I've mitigated a huge set of risks. I can actually sleep tonight before I show up for that event in the morning. And then finally, the lessons learned. So you've got this checklist that you use with the customer up front, helps set expectations, helps you determine what it is, who's responsible for what's going to be there, who's not going to be there, and so on. Well, that checklist becomes your lessons learned. And we have a lessons learned after each of these events. So we'll sit down and go, okay, what were the issues? What was the problem? What did we miss on an expectation? What wasn't talked about? And so we'll have those discussions, and sometimes it just was someone wasn't paying attention. And we'll say, oh yeah, this is when we talked about it, and we said, yes, so-and-so was going to take care of that, and it wasn't there, and they were out sick, or whatever the case is. And those are things you don't need to put on the checklist. But if it turns out it was something that you didn't know about, like, for instance, you didn't know that the entire building was only on a single 20-amp fuse, and so you decided to plug in all your lights and took out power for the entire building, then you might want to ask that question ahead of time. And actually, that is a question that I ask now. I will, if I go to a facility that I don't know where I've been or haven't been there before, I will say, can I talk to one of the electricians to verify that we have multi-amp fuses in the room because we're bringing in some pretty powerful equipment. But again, that was found out by blowing out building power. So the lessons learned is well worth adding to that checklist. Yeah, question?
Do you take a small UPS with you?
We do. Interestingly enough, on the UPS, test the UPS, because we went cheap, right? Because we figured if it died, we could go to Staples or Radio Shack. Well, those don't switch fast enough to cover things like encoders stop recording video or stop streaming video. So you need a decent UPS in order to support a true power loss without any loss of recording. Now, you're going to lose streaming because you lost power in the building, but the recorders are still going to record. And again, lessons learned, we had a cheap UPS, it all went down and stopped recording. I still had power, but it stopped recording. So test the UPS, pull the plug, is everything still running? But yeah, we do take a UPS. Good question. And then finally on the lessons learned, sometimes you're going to get a lessons learned that's like, I can't solve that in a checklist. I got to go talk to some people. I got to put together a plan. I got to figure out how to solve that particular problem. As you do more lessons learned, you're going to get rid of those bigger ones, because those bigger ones are ones that need to get solved for everything. And then you're just dealing with the little guys. But the bigger ones, you're going to have to kind of say, I need to go off. I need to talk to some other people and get an answer to that question for you and find out how we fix that particular lessons learned problem. So let's see, how are we doing time? Okay, 10 minutes. So what if it fails, right? I've done all this phenomenal preparation. I've done all my testing. I've done my lessons or my risk mitigation. I've done my checklist, and yet something still goes wrong. And I've had to have these conversations. They're not fun, but they go well because I center on the issue and maybe not so much on the reasons why a particular thing happened. We talk more about how we can mitigate it in the future. What are the things we're going to put into place? Because there's not a lot of sense in saying, well, here's everything that went wrong and why your webcast failed. We certainly talk about that, but we focus more on how it's going to get fixed in the future. It ultimately gets added to our checklist or to our risk mitigations so that doesn't happen in the future. I always make sure that I personally talk to a customer who has that issue, and I immediately find out as best I can what the issue was and contact them as soon as possible. As soon as I have some idea of what went wrong, I will contact the customer, even if I don't have the full story yet, because I want them to know that we're working on it and we're trying to get a solution for it. And a lot of the things I put into place as far as mitigation, like the recording, if I had a complete and total failure, I can go back and I say, look, we had a complete failure of the servers. The webcast didn't go out. However, we recorded the entire event. It'll be available on demand within an hour, and I'll send you the link so you can get it to your people. So they feel like we're at least helping them try and get beyond the issue and solving the problem. And then I usually will follow up. If it's a larger issue, we'll do an actual presentation. Here's where we saw the problem. Here's who was affected. And here's how we're going to solve it in the future. And that helps, I think, is that communication helps tremendously in getting past the fact of you're a horrible person and you're never going to do my webcast again, because it's not. In most cases, especially if you go through these 10 things that I gave you, they know you're a professional. And sometimes stuff happens, and if you can stay focused on what went wrong and how it's going to get fixed as opposed to pointing fingers, they're going to appreciate that too. And like I said, the last bullet, if you do the 10 previous ones, you probably won't be having these conversations. So hopefully I can keep you from doing that. So before I get to the summary, we've got a few more minutes. Any questions I didn't answer or out there that... oh, and we've got a microphone runner. Cool. So we can get those microphone questions. There's one up here.
Hey, you know, right.
Yeah. Get those on there for the webcast audience.
You said your one point of redundancy that you didn't have was the network. Have you tried using any of the wireless options that are out there now? So you're not dependent on your client's internet connection?
Yeah. So for us, all of our events are internal. So even if I was using our internal wireless, they all ultimately go through a single point router somewhere. So even though I have local redundancy, like I've got switch, the wired switch versus the wireless switch, those ultimately tier up to a single router somewhere in the building. And that's what I think of when I think of my single point of failure.
So you never use like an outside thing because everything is for internal use?
Right, it's all internal, so we use our internal network.
Got
question back there. Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the VOD? I know that's not your presentation here, but is that your own intranet, or do you use an outside vendor? Because I work for Southwest Airlines, a little smaller than you guys, but one of the problems I have is if we have a 30, 45-minute presentation, where the hell do we put it where people can watch it at a decent quality, but also not bring down our system?
Yeah, we are actually dealing with the exact same problem right now with our VOD. Primarily because of that growth chart that I showed you, is we expect VOD to kind of go through the roof. Our right now, you as an employee don't have the ability to post your own stuff. So we're managing it from that perspective. But everyone's talking about giving them the ability to post their own stuff. So they're going to get there, but and this goes back to risk mitigation. So my mitigation to that was I brought the LAN team together, these people who are respected by our CIO. And I said to the LAN team, how many connections can I support on the network today given, say, a 400 kilobit per second stream? And they said 3,500 or something like that. So here we are in the meeting. They've told me how many connections I can support. And then I can go back and I can say, well, yeah, but we want to do VOD for all of our employees. We have 145,000 employees. If they all just posted one and 2 people watched it, I'm way over my numbers. So I don't for it yet, but what I did is I mitigated my risk by bringing the minds together and saying, that's what they said I can do, so until we fix that problem, I can't do what you want me to do. So there is a discussion now about, well, how do we do that? What kind of money do we have to spend?
Even now, though, what are you using? So if you did a webcast this morning, where would you put it?
So we have our own data center, and that data center has its own storage network. So we just essentially, we scale through it. So we start out with a terabyte worth of space, and if we fill that, then we go and request another terabyte worth of space. So our space comes from our data center. As far as the network bandwidth is concerned, we rely on the network to give us statistics on how are we doing with their pipe. Are we destroying it, through this VOD process? Are you seeing bandwidth problems? But what paid off for me was letting them know ahead of time before we started doing that it was going to be a problem if we go forward, so that now they're looking at those numbers on a regular basis. But yeah, we have our own data center as far as the storage is concerned. Probably doesn't help you.
We have our own data center too, but they don't do video right now.
Okay. They won't give you space?
That's it.
Okay. Understood. Yes.
Are you using multicast for live?
Yeah, we use multicast for live.
Are you having any problems with it, and how do you mitigate the fact that multicast is not that
We
as
never
reliable?
have problems with multicast. What are you talking about?
Not as reliable as unicast connection.
We when we started doing live events, one of the things we knew up front was because we were building it with a server, that the only way we would be able to reach numbers was to do it with multicast. So as we started building this infrastructure, we talked a lot to our network folks, and we would say, hey, could you just turn on multicast on that router for us and give us a multicast IP address? And they said, oh, sure, because they didn't know what we were doing. So we kind of started to build out multicast. And then once they learned what we were doing, then they started adding that automatically through their network upgrades. So it was kind of a ground roots issue. But no, we still have issues. Multicast is relatively robust in our environment, and that's probably because we've been pushing for, 6 to 7 years now by delivery of live events via multicast. So we have a lot of people who pay attention to when they put in new routers that it's configured appropriately. But we still lose an entire, we lost 8,000 folks watching because a router wasn't configured correctly after being replaced. So multicast essentially was turned off, and we took down an entire segment of our network in unicast connection. So
We had a similar scenario with some instructions and so on.
yeah. So again, it does go back to that test. At minimum, at least you can say, oh, let's get somebody in that location to at least bring up the test. Are you getting multicast? Great. So we know at that point it works. If something changes between now and then, it changes, but you tested. And that's where I always try to go due diligence. But something changed. So let's find out what that is. But it wasn't like we just ignored it. But unfortunately, I don't have a perfect scenario for how do I get multicast work all the time. Wish I did. Any other questions? So I think I hit most of these actually already. Take note of any problems or failures during the webcast. Listen to your customers on your production team, what's working, where their pain points are, because those pain points in most cases are going to turn into risk problems. And if you can get rid of the pain points, then you can get rid of the risks or mitigate the risks. So that's pretty much all I had. I appreciate you guys on the last session showing up. Thank you very much, and I'll actually get you out of here on time. So thank you.